Sometimes what happened after a shipwreck can be more interesting than the wreck itself. A good example of that is the wooden steamer John Craig's wreck in 1903. On Saturday, May 19, 1888, the Craig became the largest boat ever to be launched into the Detroit River. Constructed at Trenton, Michigan, she measured 297 feet in overall length, 41 feet in beam, and 20 feet in depth. For the next 15 shipping seasons, she became a fairly common sight around the Great Lakes. At first, she worked the Ashland and Duluth iron ore trade with the lower lake steel mills. Later, big steel lake boats outclassed her in that trade, and she went into the grain trade. Her twin smokestacks did not set her apart from other lake freighters, as there were many with two stacks. She also normally towed a schooner barge and seemed to just blend in with the lake traffic. On the evening of Tuesday, June 23, 1903, she departed Chicago with a hold filled with 95,000 bushels of corn, bound for Meaford, Ontario on Georgian Bay. As the Craig proceeded up Lake Michigan, a dense fog was encountered. All Captain Murphy had to aid his navigation was eyes, ears, and his magnetic compass. At 11:30 on Thursday morning, June 25, 1903, as the Craig neared the Straits of Mackinac, all three of those failed, as the John Craig ran directly onto Simmons Reef at nearly full speed. The twisting of her hull and the sickening, thunderous crunch of her tortured timbers told Chief Peter Mullen that she was finished, and he started venting steam from her boilers to prevent an explosion as the cold lake rushed into his engine room. Later that day, as the fog began to lift, the stranded steamer was sighted, and the word was telegraphed across the lakes. The big wrecking tug Favorite was immediately requested. The Craig's owner, J.C. Gilchrist, received word from Captain Murphy that if a temporary bulkhead between hatches 1 and 2 could be built, they may be able to pump her free of water. Yet the good captain had no idea what the extent of damages really were, as the rocks from the reef punched multiple holes in her bottom and went far into her cargo hold. So far, the 1903 season had been fairly absent of major accidents. Now the Craig's grounding could be the most costly so far that season. If you think that today's, quote, journalism is messed up, here's a fine example of how messed up it was in 1903. The headline reads that the Craig, quote, will be a total loss. But the final paragraph of the column states just the opposite. It states that a cofferdam and 5 divers may just get her raised and taken to dry dock. Of course, 6 days later, they state now that J.C. Gilchrist has in fact given up on her. Yet Captain Harrow of the wrecker Favorite decided to keep working on her. He said that it would take 7 steam pumps, 5 divers, and another 5 days to get her afloat. In fact, he got her off the rocks a little bit late by 1 day. Now it was reported that her fleet mate, the Yakima, under the command of Captain Garrison, would tow the wreck down to Port Huron. But then an odd twist took place. The following day it was reported that the Yakima would not tow the Craig down the lake. Instead, the wrecker Favorite would do the job. The reason given for the switch was that since the Craig's rudder was gone, Captain Garrison wouldn't let his boat take her in tow. However, that made no sense. Freighters of that class have often rafted with other boats whose steering gear was disabled and towed them for great distances. A better explanation could be that Captain Harrow of the Favorite refused to hand the wreck over to the Gilchrist boat. He had spent weeks and a lot of money raising and recovering the damaged steamer. And if he handed her over, he just may have to fight in court to get his salvage bills paid. But If he alone got her to Port Huron, he could more likely turn his bills over to the insurance underwriters by hand, and not only that, he could also charge them for the towing fee. Indeed, the favorite made the tow to Port Huron. Once in the channel of the St. Clair River, the favorite was joined by the Gilchrist freighter, City of Naples, as they carefully delivered the Craig to the insurance underwriters at a dock near the foot of Griswold Street. And along with that, they delivered Captain Harrow's bills. It was July 19th, nearly a month after the Craig had fetched up on Simmons Reef, and her hold was still mostly filled with wet, rotting, and sprouting corn. The smell along the shore must have been awful. In spite of that, the folks from the Brantford Starch Company of Oswego showed up in Port Huron, looking to, perhaps, buy some of the remaining corn. I found no record as to if they made a buy or simply left holding their noses. By July 25th, the cargo had been fully removed from the wreck, and she was prepared for towing down to the Detroit Shipbuilding Company's dry dock. Once in the dry dock, at first glance, she didn't look too bad, but it was soon found that her hull was badly twisted. In this early photo, you can clearly see that her forward mast leans to port. Additionally, the area where her rudder had been shows what looks like the trunk timbers having been shoved out. After the water was drained from the dry dock, things looked even worse. Her stem timbers were completely gone. From the starboard bow, her bottom planking was loose, and if she were to be rebuilt, about 60 feet of it would have to be replaced. There was also a large hole where the rocks at Simmons Reef had been driven into her hull. This is that hole. One marine reporter said that you could drive a team of horses through it. Here we see why it took from June 25th to July 14th to get her off of that reef. This is the canvas and timbers patchwork done by the hard hat divers in order to reduce the flooding to a point where the steam pumps could keep up and keep her afloat. She was resting in 20 feet of water, so every single timber that you see here had to be nailed in underwater by the divers. While they worked on the outside, ship's carpenters were building this bulkhead on the inside. It needed to be solid and watertight. Now the insurance adjusters had to decide if she was a total wreck and if they needed to pay J.C. Gilchrist for her. And so, the wreck of the John Craig and the wreckers, as well as J.C. Gilchrist, all waited. By September 10th, the wreckers had waited long enough. Their bill for the Favorite and Captain Harrow's Herculean effort to recover the boat came to exactly $22,405.65. And the only way to get the insurance slugs to move was to arrest the boat. Thus, the U.S. Marshals seized the Craig and would put her up for auction on Thursday, September 23rd. On that day, the Dean of Great Lakes Wooden Ships, Captain James Davidson, bought the wrecked steamer for just $11,000, plus what was now said to be owed to the wreckers, plus a $10,000 claim against the boat by her former owner, J.C. Gilchrist. Thus, Davidson got the wreck for a total investment of just $41,000, and he calculated that it would take another $20,000 to rebuild her. She would then join Davidson's fleet of big wooden vessels and tow some of his huge wooden schooner barges. He likely figured that she would probably run for more than 2 more decades. He was wrong. Following May, the completely rebuilt John Craig returned to service as the Panama under the command of Captain Stevenson. Spin the clock ahead to November of 1906. A fast-moving low-pressure system came ashore from the Gulf of Mexico on November 20th, then passed over Michigan the following day. Worst of all, as it departed, it pulled down frigid air out of Canada. With the 336-foot-long wooden schooner barge Matanzas in tow, the Panama was under the command of Captain Jones and out on Lake Superior. Both boats had full loads of coal aboard, and it is thought that the barge put enough stress on the steamer to cause her to seriously spring a leak. Not wanting the steamer to founder in deep water, Captain Jones decided to beach her on the Keweenaw. The barge was cast loose and safely came to anchor as the Panama crashed ashore. Her crew abandoned her there, near the mouth of the Mineral River, and they camped out in the woods until they could make their way to civilization. Matanzas was recovered by a fishing tug and towed to safety. Upon hearing that the Panama was ashore, Captain Davidson immediately loaded a tug with salvage gear and they headed for Lake Superior. Unfortunately, as that storm departed, that ultra-cold air that had come down behind it caused the waves breaking over the wreck to turn her into a solid iceberg. She'd have to remain there until spring. The following spring, the Davidson crew returned, and all they could do was remove her engine equipment. That was almost the end of the story of the John Craig, except for the fact that Captain Davidson transplanted her engine into the steel freighter Honduras. That vessel left the lakes in 1912 and burned in the Atlantic in 1919. Now, you can, however, still see the Panama's wreck by way of Google Earth. It was an interesting path from Simmons Reef to where she rests today.